Hey all, we're back. We're going to finish up our discussion with nuclear. For the next couple of videos, we're going to talk about problems, specific events that were problems, things that have gone wrong. Nuclear waste, right? We haven't really touched that issue. And then, the politics, right? The charts and graphs. And then that'll finish us up with our discussion regarding nuclear. So last week, you watched a couple of videos that kind of highlighted some specific nuclear accidents. The three that we're going to focus on are really probably the three most recent and most significant, and frankly, for a lot of people, really the most scary, right? And the first one we're going to start with is 1979. It's the year I was born, so go 1979. And this was the disaster outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, of 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island's a name that everyone recognizes. We know of it as a nuclear disaster, but again, maybe just the general public doesn't fully understand what happened there. But now that we have our really in-depth and great discussion and understanding of how a light water reactor or a nuclear reactor in general works, we're going to essentially highlight what happened, although the videos you guys looked at last week are in much more detail, so we'll just kind of skim across them pretty quickly. So in the case of 3 Mile Island, well, actually in all three of the cases we're going to talk about, really the problem is with the core and keeping the core cold. So remember, we've got fuel rods and control rods. In 3 Mile Island, essentially they lost their main water feed, and what had happened is a bunch of the fuel rods actually became uncovered, so there was no water on them. So you guys know that when that happens, the decay reaction is going to slow, but there's still an incredible amount of heat in those fuels, and the decay reaction takes some time to cool off or to slow down, especially if the control rods aren't in place. I believe in 3 Mile Island they did put the control rods in place, but the heat generated was so great that once they kind of realized what had happened, they tried to add more water, it shattered the fuel, and the core began to melt, right? So that's, the ultimate nuclear accident, right? Meltdown. Although, remember that this core is in a kind of like Russian doll nested manner, right? So if there's a problem in the core, there should be, multiple layers of protection to keep that reaction or that accident contained. So in the case of 3 Mile Island, about half of the core melted. It kind of pools up here, forms this cool geological material that we call corium. Corium is just melted reactor core. It turns into a magma. But what happened in the case of 3 Mile Island, so this was a disaster. Most of the radiation that was caused by the conversion of the solid material to a gas, because it creates radioactive gas, was contained. I think that there is a very small amount of radiation released, but 3 Mile Island, as disastrous as it was generally contained. A lot of the material associated with this disaster, kind of interesting fun fact, is actually contained out in the Idaho desert at the Idaho National Lab, right? That's we keep some kind of nuclear waste there. We basically put it in a nuclear body bag and dumped it out in the desert for now. As we'll see, we're going to explore that concept a little bit later. So the next disaster we're going to talk about, 1986, Chernobyl, in what was then Russia, what is now what we recognize as Ukraine. And in this case, there was really kind of some pretty significant issues. So this was a reactor this is a nuclear power plant that had, I think, 4 reactors. And in 1986, in the case of Chernobyl, the scientists were running some tests because this was a fairly new reactor. So they were testing the backup pumps and the generators associated. There was a power surge. And again, we get meltdown, right? So the core starts to melt, which is something that we saw in the case of 3 Mile Island. Now, when this happens, you might remember that this stuff is essentially contained. There's hydrogen gas produced. There's a bunch of other things that really make the condition fairly critical. And there was a pressure issue, right? So pressure started to build, and it essentially created a bomb. And so the core of the reactor actually exploded because of the pressure created by the meltdown itself. So here, this is quite a bit different than 3 Mile Island in the sense that 3 Mile Island, there was definitely toxic stuff produced, but it was contained. Here, the secondary and tertiary, which is the third and even the quaternary, right, the fourth, containment levels didn't exist. And so when this reactor exploded, it actually just blew a hole in the side of the building. And at that point, nuclear disaster, right? When people talk about nuclear disasters and they think of Chernobyl as really about as bad as it can get, right? It tops out the level of nuclear disaster, right? So full meltdown, explosion, blows a hole in the side of the building. And when that happens, all of the gases that were created, all the cesium, all the the krypton, the tellurides, all of that crazy stuff, the kind of decay products that we've been talking about, that stuff is all in gas form and it just ends up as a cloud of radiation. And actually they tracked the radiation cloud from Chernobyl all the way across Europe, although it's largely dissipated now. And one of the cool things, I guess it's a cool thing about Chernobyl is there was a small town of about 50,000 people. It was evacuated. I think 200,000 people were evacuated from the surrounding area. And because of the elevated levels of radiation, this is what's known as the exclusion zone. You can't live there. And so the town was essentially evacuated in a very short amount of time, which means the town still stands, right? So there's infrastructure for 50,000 people. And it's actually a really interesting story in what happens when humans leave, right? So the town is actually kind of degraded and gone back to nature. No one's pulling roots out of the sidewalk, right? The trees are just growing up through the streets. All the buildings are still there. There's bears and foxes and all sorts of animals that live there. Famously, there was like a small amusement park there. You can see one of the most iconic pictures is this Ferris wheel that was in town, and there's also, again, you can see some bumper cars and all kinds of crazy stuff. So when we think about Chernobyl, it's as bad as it gets, right? Full meltdown, released as gas into the air. But now that we are kind of on sometime later, remember this accident was 1986, you can go to Chernobyl as tourists now. Like the radiation levels in the area are low enough that you can visit for a short time and be fine. They've actually been doing some tests. Of course, lots of researchers are doing tests on animals that live in the area. And what they've found is in the bones and muscles of those animals, there are essentially unprecedented levels of radiation, incredibly high levels of radiation, but they haven't found any significant occurrence of mutation. So what some people are starting to think is, well, if Chernobyl's as bad as it gets, it wasn't that bad? I don't know. That's hard to say. I mean, that really depends on your frame of reference, right? One thing that is easy to say is if we compare that to a modern, what we call fourth generation nuclear technology, this isn't even really possible in modern technology. So with the Chernobyl incident, you guys saw in the video that they initially encased it in a concrete sarcophagus. That's now been replaced by this giant dome structure that was built and kind of slid over the reactor at Chernobyl. And so the portion that is really dangerous is contained. And one thing I guess I forgot to mention, so one of the most iconic images from the Chernobyl meltdown is when the core melted, it turns into a magma, right? That magma will pour out and melt through the bottom of the reactor and formed this kind of pool of what we call corium. In this case, it's referred to as the elephant's foot. So it's really highly radioactive magma sitting there. And so you can see here, it's a couple of all sorts of images of the famous elephant's foot from the Chernobyl reaction, or from the Chernobyl meltdown. So the last one that we're going to talk about, you guys watched a long and, I apologize, dry video about the Fukushima Daiichi meltdown and nuclear disaster. This was Japan 2011. So again, fairly modern. So it's important to remember that this is a fairly old reactor, but there were 4 different reactors at the Fukushima plant. And generally, there was a really large earthquake, like a magnitude 9. Really, really, really large types of earthquakes that we have, maybe once a decade or so on planet Earth. And so that occurred here near Japan, just geologically exactly where we'd expect. And it caused famously a tsunami, and that tsunami pushed through and damaged the plant. And a lot of the damage that was associated actually had to do with the water. So some of the things that occurred are the power was lost to the plant. The backup generators that are intended to keep cycling water to cool the reactors, those generators lost power. They ran, everything was hunky-dory for maybe a day. I think those generators ran for about 24 hours before they finally shut down. There was an issue with a heat exchanger in another one of the reactors. And ultimately, all 4 of those blew up in one manner or another. This had to do with hydrogen gas and some other kind of chemical details that we don't need to get into, but fairly explosive. And again, in this case, which is different than 3 Mile Island, a portion of the core itself was vaporized during the meltdown, and during the explosion, essentially blows the roof off of the containment. Right, this kind of talked about this notion of Russian nesting dolls, and all of that gas is then released to the atmosphere. So when we think about those 3 large disasters, 3 Mile Island was the least disastrous. Chernobyl and Fukushima are of similar magnitude. The ultimate result is, radioactive cesium and other elements that end up out in the atmosphere. We kind of create this exclusion zone, a place where you're not supposed to go for some set amount of years. But we can see, even in the case of Chernobyl, where it's been a little bit over 30 years, people can go there now. You can't live there, but you can go there and visit. So I assume that we'll see something similar with Fukushima, right? So the radiation levels right now, a few years after this 2011 disaster, are still really high. But the initial danger will wear off in a short amount of time, although the elevated radiation levels are likely to continue for hundreds of years. In some cases, some of these elements are actually going to be detectable for thousands of years. So again, when we look back at these 3 disasters, they're fairly regular: 1979, 1986, 2011. But all of them were essentially old reactor technology. None of them were with Generation 4. It's just kind of much safer and much more modern. But again, this is as bad as it gets, right? Chernobyl particularly, the core explodes and blows actually fuel out into the environment. It seems like, it really depends on kind of your philosophy here, but one of the things to think of overall is, on average, about 25 people per year die in accidents associated with coal mining. Burning that coal is releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. Compared to nuclear, does not release CO2 into the atmosphere. And although a few of these accidents are really scary and highly publicized, the death rates associated with nuclear power are far, far, far lower than 25 people a year, right? That's absurd. And there's actually some connections that have been made to your chances of dying in a plane crash versus your chances of dying in a car wreck, right? Obviously, the mortality rates of land-based travel is much higher than air-based travel, but accidents, plane crashes are really scary. So people are freaked out about it, but you don't get in your car and get freaked out every morning because that's much more commonplace, as is kind of parallel with coal and nuclear. All right, so we're gonna move on and talk about nuclear waste, which is really one of the biggest downsides, and then we'll talk about nuclear politics a little bit.